Welcome back to Fixing Furniture. I have a farmhouse table that needs some refinishing. A farmhouse table typically has turned legs on it with a very thick top. The finish is failing, and I'll show you several different ways to identify a finish that's failing, but I'll also show you different techniques to strip off that finish so you can get it back to bare wood. I'll finish up by showing you the different techniques I use to stain pine, because it can be very tricky, and then put on a durable top coat. Stick with me, I'll show you how it's done.
As a furniture repair business, we're opening the doors to our workshop to show you the tools and techniques to repair furniture.
The front rail here, you can see this has been broken off.
We give you tips to make your repair projects easier. Let's get into the workshop and start fixing furniture.
This farmhouse table has been the gathering place for my family for dinner for over 15 years. Lori and I purchased this table brand new, and it's got a lacquer finish on it. But unfortunately, the finish is failing. I'll show you some close-ups here so you can recognize what a failing finish looks like. The most obvious signs are right here, where you can see the finish has come right off, and you can see it here as well more recently. But over here, you can see the finish is actually gummed up. It's become soft, and there's a texture here, so that's definitely a failed finish. Another symptom of an old finish is it doesn't hold up well to moisture or heat. So I've got a cold glass of water here, the condensation's building on the outside, and I'll let this sit for a minute and we'll see what happens. I'll get a hot mug of water as well, put it on here, and see how the finish reacts. Here's a mug of really hot water, so we'll just let that sit there for a minute. And this has condensation building up, and condensation drips down and puts moisture on the table. And here you can see we've got a light colored ring. So the moisture here is penetrating through the finish and leaving this white ring. Now on my particular table, this does disappear over time, that moisture comes back out, but a wet, cold drink can do that to an older finish. Now on this piece here, the mug is heating up. You can see the steam coming out of it, it's pretty hot. Let's see if anything happens here when I try to move it. No, you can't see anything, but I can actually feel a tackiness when I try to move that mug. See if I can illustrate it by trying to push it. There's a bit of tackiness there. So it is lifting a little bit. These spots here have come from really hot dishes before, so it's not good practice to put hot things on a surface anyway, but when you've got a hard-working surface here, you want to protect it with the best finish possible. And I'll tell you more about that a little bit later. Now you can recognize some signs of a failing finish. So my next step is I'm going to unscrew the legs from this table, move the table into the workshop, and I'm going to show you a number of different ways that you can strip the finish off and prepare it for a new finish. Farmhouse tables are sometimes called harvest tables, and where I live, they're always made out of pine. You can see how easy it was for me to move this. This is pine, meaning it's softwood, which means it's light. If this was made out of something like white oak, it would take at least 2 people to move a tabletop this thick. What I'm going to do now is show you the different ways that I can strip this off. We can use mechanical means and we can use chemical means. And if you've watched my show regularly, you'll understand that I like to avoid chemicals as much as possible, so I'm not exposing myself to health risks. So let's start with the mechanical first. So there are 2 different options for sanders, and I'll get to those in a minute. But another way to use mechanical means is a scraper. This is one style of scraper. They come in different styles. And another one is called a cabinet scraper or card scraper. This has an edge on it that has a bit of a burr, so what we can do is use this to scrape it off. Essentially what we're doing is looking to take off that finish so that we've got it smooth, and we're preparing it before we put the stain or the finish on it. So I'll set these 2 aside and talk about sanding first. This is called a quarter sheet sander because the sandpaper used in here is 1/4 of a full sheet of sandpaper. This is an older style. This is a newer style of sander. It's very common in workshops now. It's a random orbital sander, and it's designed to not leave swirl marks in your wood when you're ready to put a finish on it. So these are good for finishing, but the sanding pads are fairly expensive. And going through and sanding a finish, the finish can really gum up sandpaper in a hurry and can leave swirl marks. So a quarter sheet sander might be a good option, but if you're intimidated by having to cut these sheets in quarters, I'll show you a trick for that. I've got a jig here that's just a right angle, I've got a line here, and a hacksaw blade that's screwed down with a little bit of a gap underneath it. So all I need to do is get that sandpaper underneath here, line it up with the fence on this side, hold down the hacksaw blade, and there you get a half a sheet So if you have a half sheet sander, that's the right size. And then for a quarter sheet, I just line it up to this line. Again, hold down the hacksaw blade. So it's a real quick way to make quarter sheets out of a full sheet of sandpaper. My last word of advice on sanders is if you're using a quarter sheet sander to strip the finish off, you need to use a random orbital sander to make sure you get rid of the swirl marks that this will leave behind. So it's a good workhorse, but this is really the finishing sander you need. I'll get these machines hooked up with the right sandpaper, test them out, and you can see how they work. With just a little bit of sanding I did here, you can see there's already built up on the sandpaper here quite a bit, and right in the center here there's a fair bit. This is the finish that's coming off, and it will end up leaving marks in the finish that you will have to sand out later, but you can see how quickly that clogs up. The other thing is this is very dusty, so you want to use dust collection. Put a vacuum on here to protect your lungs. You'll need to wear a respirator, and you need some hearing protection as well. But there's an easier way. Some people might think a belt sander is faster. Well, it would take off the finish in a hurry, but it would also ruin the surface of the table. So a belt sander's not an answer here. What I want to show you is a card scraper. So card scraper has an edge on it that you push off the finish. And I put a little bit of a bend in it here and just lean into the finish. And look how that comes off. So in the sanding it took with the sanding machine, look how quickly that comes off. Now, if you don't have a card scraper, these are relatively inexpensive. There's also, you can buy these at a paint store and a hardware store, a regular scraper. And you can see, this will get some of the finish off. You can see it coming here, but it's not as effective as a card scraper. So I'm going to use this because it's not noisy, it's not dusty, and it's much more enjoyable to use. It does take a little bit of muscle, but it's a good workout. Now the scraping technique I'm using, I'm rubbing one of my knuckles here. So what I'm going to do is just take some protective tape here and wrap it around that knuckle. And that just prevents some skin wear. For some reason I'm not getting it here, but that'll just make it more comfortable as I work through the table. I'm about a quarter done on this table, and it's taken me 15 to 20 minutes to do this work. Now, if you're not up for this physical labor or it's something you're not able to do, there are the option of using strippers. So if you're using a chemical stripper, it can take off this finish relatively easily. Unfortunately, it ends up producing hazardous waste. You need proper protection of your lungs, proper protection of your skin and your clothes, and the area that you're working around. You need to work in a well-ventilated area. There have been some eco-friendly products that have come on the market over the years, and depending on the finish that you're stripping, they might be effective, they might not be. I'm working with lacquer here. A shellac finish is generally easy to take off. A polyurethane is very difficult to take off. So it depends on the product that you're using, but what I'll do is finish scraping this half the table off. I'll turn it around, I'll put a little bit of each of these on here, and you can see how they work. Another card scraper tip, if you take a magnet and put it on the back, these can get heated up pretty quickly with the friction. This way it protects your fingers from getting heated up. I'm going to put the stripper on the sides here because sometimes the stripper can discolor things. I don't want a discolored spot on the surface of the table. So the first thing I'm putting on here is a new stripper that I'm trying. And you can see this one on a video where I've done a French polish on a table. And the second one I've got here is a chemical stripper. So I'll put that right here and we'll see how that reacts. And then the third one I've got is a soya-based stripper. And it says you have to put it on thick and let it sit until you start to see the finish come off. So the chemical-based stripper is probably 5 minutes. These other two might be 30 minutes or more. So I'll continue stripping the table and keep an eye on these. Okay, it's been about 5 minutes. Right here is where the chemical stripper is. Let's see how it does. So it's taken off the first surface there, but it does need another coat on there to help bring that off. You can see if I try to scrape where the stripper isn't, I'm just getting a little bit on the edge there, a bit of residue. But yeah, it's done pretty well. Let's test the soya-based here. Oh, it is starting to move stuff. Look at that. Wow, that's worked better than I expected. Okay, so it's taking off a layer there. Now, let me wipe this off. And then over here on the end, let's see if there's been anything that's changed. Just a little bit, yeah. The stripper doesn't seem to do all that much. So of these two, it looks like the soy-based stripper took off more residue, but this is getting off more of the finish. So maybe that was just a cleaning process. So when you're working on a vertical surface like this, it's more difficult to strip. When you're working on a horizontal surface, you can let these things puddle up, and the more chemicals or product that's on there, the more that they'll blister, the easier they'll strip. So there's 3 options for you. You can try what products are in your local market. So the finish is cleaned off now. The next step is to vacuum it off with an upholstery brush, get rid of all the dust that's on here, and then sand it down twice. First with 120 and then 220. Then I can check the surface and see that I'm ready for the stain. I've got the lights down low for a reason here. You can see I've sanded this half the table. I haven't that, so it does take some color off. But you can see here where I've got a pencil, I've got some flaws on the table. And I could leave those in, but I prefer to take these out. There's a few here, and if I come over here, because of the way I've got the light, you can see there's a mark right here and another one right here. And I'm going to use steam to take those dents out. So here I'm just adding water to the surface. This one has finish in it, so I don't think it's going to raise, but let's just give it a test. Hot iron. Yep, it worked there and not here. So the finish here is likely preventing the water from getting in there and raising the wood fibers. So I'll need to clear that out and then I can restore that. I sanded this down to 220 and we're almost ready for the stain. There are 2 things I need to do first though. Common mistakes when working with pine. Pine absorbs stain in a way that it can be blotchy. So here's an example. This is what it looks like. But this is what I want. I want a nice smooth stain absorption. So this is called a preconditioner that goes on before the stain. It allows this to happen. So I'll put that on. And then the other thing is end grain really absorbs a lot of stain. So you can see here it's going to be very, very dark, unless I pre-treat it with something. This has the wood conditioner on it, and that didn't prevent it. This has a bunch of polyurethane. I put on a fair bit. So what I'm going to do is just put a light coat on the end here, and that means that this and this surface should be a matching color. I'm now going to move this table outdoors, and that way I'm working in a well-ventilated area and I'm not using these chemicals inside my workshop. So I'm all set to go here outside. I'm under a roof, so I'm protected from anything that might fall. And the process I'm going through is the pre-stain, the wood conditioner, and then the stain, and then the polyurethane. Now, I'm using oil-based products here, and I've chosen these specifically. As you've seen me in my workshop, I love using water-based material when I'm doing repairs and restoration, but I find a water-based stain across a large area, to me, looks a bit like it's painted. So oil-based stains are the way I prefer to go, but the downside of it is we're dealing with chemicals. So I need to be wearing gloves to protect my skin. I need to be wearing an organic respirator, so I'm protecting my lungs. Even in the outdoors like this, I'm going to be leaning over top of this, so the fumes will be coming off. I want to protect my lungs. And it all starts with using a tack rag. So I'll pull out some tack rags, we'll take off the final dust here and get it prepared. Now I've just cut these tack rags into smaller sections so I can make the most use of it. And the reasons I'm using polyurethane on this farmhouse table is because it's going to give me a really durable finish. We'd used this table for about 15 years, multiple times a day, and the lacquer just deteriorated over time. The polyurethane will stand up to the abuse of the moisture that's going on it, the sunlight. So it's a durable finish, something that's much better than lacquer or shellac for a hard working surface. So let me show you how this works. The tack rag is a sticky rag. It's a piece of cheesecloth. And I have used a shop vac on this. And you can see here how much dust is going to come off, even though I've used a really strong vacuum to take the dust off. So you see the discoloration here? That's all the dust I'm picking up. As I said, the first stage of this is the wood conditioner. And with any finish, you need to make sure you're stirring it thoroughly so it gets well mixed before you use it. And then another tip I have for you is when you're working with a finish, work away from you, start there, and work towards you. That way, if you've got any drips that are happening, they're happening in the unfinished area, you won't be ruining the area you've already been going over. I'm using a foam applicator for this. It just makes it easy to do for something like this. I'll put my respirator on and get going. Okay, so now it's been about 15 minutes, and what I want to do is remove the excess. There's some shiny spots here where it hasn't absorbed, so it's just a matter of taking a clean cloth and wiping it down. And then what I'll do is I'll let it sit for about a half an hour, and then I'm going to put the stain on. When you're following directions like this, it's important that you pay attention to what's on the can and not necessarily what I'm doing with the products that I'm using. I'll mix up the stain really well here, and then I can apply the coat.
The stain has now absorbed enough that I can wipe it off, and this is where I get to see the true color of what's happening. Keep wiping this down until I don't get any more residue on the rags. And it's really important that when you're done with the rags, you lay them out to dry. Rags that have oil in them and are balled up could actually combust and create a fire. So make sure you're being safe and dry them out.
Well, I've had a change in plans. Mother Nature isn't cooperating with what I want to do. It's going to be too cool out, and when it's cool outside, that means the polyurethane is going to take much longer to dry in between coats. So I moved indoors here, but because I have such a small workshop, that means when I put a coat on here, I have to leave the workshop and I can't do any other work today. So if you want to take a look at my workshop tour, you can check out a previous video I just did on that. You can see the space that I work in. Now, if I had a finishing room, that would be ideal. I could maybe spray on a finish here and then leave, or put on a brush coat finish like I'm going to now. So first step here, use a tack rag, get all the dust off, and then open the polyurethane, mix it up really thoroughly, and then I can apply it. I'm applying it with a brush, and I'm gonna have my respirator on, so I won't be talking, but I'll show you some of the footage here of me putting on the polyurethane.
When you're brushing on a finish, you want to make sure that you're tipping it off, and that's smoothing it out before you move on to the next section. Do this a little bit at a time, and you'll end up with a nice smooth finish. After the first coat is dried, I just knock off the dust nibs with a fresh blade, hold it at a steep angle, and you're good to go. After the second coat's dried, I use some 320 sandpaper. This is wet sandpaper that I can use. Now, if you sand it on a table without using any lubricant, what you'll end up doing is getting some corning pretty quickly. And that corning will build up on sandpaper and then cause some damage. So let me just show you a little bit here, sanding away. And you can see, here's the corning that's building up. And the result on the table is you end up with these long scratches. So there's a way to avoid that. What you do is add some mineral oil to the surface. What that does is it lubricates the sandpaper and prevents that corning from building up as quickly. So it's something that you can apply, and then once you're done, wipe it up with some mineral spirits, and you'll be good to go to put on the third coat.
The third coat of polyurethane has now dried for 48 hours. So it's time for the last two steps. But before I get to that, I want to let you know we've got a lot of videos on our channel about different tips on furniture repair and restoration. We're all about education, so check them out. I also offer one-on-one advice sessions via Zoom. We can talk about the challenges you're having with your project, I can understand your skills, your tools, and I can give you tailored advice for you to have some success. You can check those out on our website, wouldn'titbenice.ca. So the last two steps on this table are to first knock off the dust nibs and then second rub out the finish. So to knock off the dust nibs, as I've shown you before, I use a blade to go across at a very sharp angle and that just takes them off. Now for rubbing out the finish, what I need to do is wait until this finish is as hard as possible. And with oil-based polyurethane, that can be a couple of weeks. The way I test for it is I put my nose against the finish and breathe in. If I can still smell the finish, it's still curing. So with the magic of video, I'm going to fast forward to 2 weeks from now when this finish is as hard as possible and we'll rub it out.
Be sure to go to our website and subscribe to our newsletter for links to new videos, workshop tips, and more. Now back to fixing furniture.
The polyurethane on this table is now fully cured, so it's ready for the rubbing out process. But before I show you that, I want to share a few books that have helped me over the years understanding furniture finishing. This one is Finishing by Jeff Jewett. It's a Taunton Press publication. This one is Classic Finishes. Sam Allen is the author. This is really great for learning how to do French polishing. And this third one here, a great reference guide, Understanding Wood Finishing. This is by Bob Flexner, one of the most well-known people about teaching finishing. So I'll leave links to these in the video description, and if you purchase those through Amazon, it gives us a few percentages and helps us fund our video production work. So let's get down to the rubbing out. I'm going to start by making sure we get rid of all those dust nibs first and then rub it out with steel wool. I have noticed the odd spot here that I still have a dust nib. You can see it there. It's really hard to capture this on film, but I'll just move the camera a little bit and you can see that it's staying around there. So again, I'm just taking a sharp knife and the bevel of the knife needs to be parallel with the surface, and that blade will allow me to scrape that off and get it level. So go around the table, make sure I don't have any more of these on the table like this, and then we'll get out the steel wool. So the last step, rubbing out the finish, is sometimes called finish the finish. What I'm going to be doing is using steel wool. Now this is 4/0 steel wool, so it's 4 zeros. It's super fine steel wool, and it's soft enough that you can rub it on your skin and it doesn't hurt. So what it's doing is it's putting very tiny scratches in the surface, and what it's doing is dulling the surface so it's not going to be as shiny. Right now I've got a semi-gloss finish here, too much gloss for my taste. So when you're using steel wool, you can lubricate it and it will slow down the cutting process. So you can use traditional wax that has solvents in it, but I prefer using something that doesn't have solvents in it. This is a beeswax and an orange oil. So I'm going to be putting this on, rubbing it with the grain, sort of medium pressure on it, but the key thing in doing this is making sure that you've got a consistent rubbing pattern all the way through. You don't want to be overlapping because you could get a different sheen then. And when we get to the edges, I'll show you a technique I use there to make sure I'm not rubbing the finish off of the corner of the table. I'll start off by showing you, if you unroll this, what you can do is just tear it off. This will give you a small pad you can work with, and that way you get more out of the steel wool roll. And the technique I'm using here is I'm just going to put a bit of the wax, and what I want to do is just come up to the edge and work the edges first before I do the table surface. If I'm doing the table surface and I come back like this, what I'll be doing is wearing off the edge of that finish. So finish the edges here first, like this, and then when you're working the body, you can work this way back. The thing that you want to avoid is covering an area twice when you're rubbing it out. That way the sheen is going to be different on the area you've worked on and then gone over the second time. You can also see here that the finish on the end here is the same color as the top. That was applying that polyurethane before putting on the stain that prevented that from getting really dark. So I finished this part here. Now what I'm going to do is do some nice long strokes on the table here.
and get to about the halfway point on the table. And that way I won't be creating overlaps. So I've just drawn the curtains here so I get a little bit of a reflection, but it's great to work in good light because you can see the reflection, what's happening. So again, I'm working almost to the end here and then to the midpoint. So as I'm rubbing this, I'm overlapping about 80%, and that way I'm going over each section roughly about 5 times, and that way I should get a nice even sheen. And once I've done this, I'll let it sit for about 20 minutes and then come back and give it a polish. Now for the moment of truth, I've got a soft, clean cloth here. Wipe it down and we'll see what it looks like. After wiping off the wax, I'm still finding this has a little bit of a sheen to it, so I'm just using the dry steel wool and rubbing it down. To take down more of that sheen, I'm looking for more of a satin look. I've now got the finish exactly the way I want it. It's a nice satin finish. Not only that, it's silky smooth. That's how you tell a quality finish. It's not just how it looks, but how it feels as well. I hope you've learned a few new things from this video, and we've got lots of videos in our inventory. I'll leave one over here that I know you'll enjoy. Thanks for watching Fixing Furniture.